Thank you very much, Christian, for this kind introduction. It's encouraging to have support of the Collegium throughout my research project. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear students, dear professors, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to also welcome you to Collegium Helveticum. Thank you very much for joining us today and your interest in our conference. It's my great honor also that I can welcome Jeff Larson and Mark Andreevich as two plenary speakers. They were supportive throughout the project and involved already in the initial phase of organizing this event, and they have taken the time to be here and fly all the way from California. So thank you very much for all your support. As already mentioned, I have to thank you also the Collegium Helveticum and the EURIAS Fellowship Program. This is the European Institutes for Advanced Study research program, for enabling me to take the research here in Zurich and take kind of a research retreat from my home institute in Slovenia, and of course for pushing me out of the comfort zone in Slovenia. So it's always challenging to be in another institution where you even don't know how to make a phone call. How many zeros do you have to press? So I'd like also to thank Professor Thomas Hengartner, the director of the institute. We had discussion on impacts on big data, algorithms on criminal justice and democracy at large already in October, and he was throughout my process of involved of research here in Collegium being kind of supportive, and he just was like, yeah, invite those people here that know something about it. So I was thinking of Jeff Larson, for instance, and Mark Andreevich as first to invite. I'd like also to thank Hartmut von Sass, Deputy Director, for initial help at the beginning of my stay. Also would like to have Andrea Trutman, Managing Head of the Collegium, for her patience, and her right hand Noah, who will be here later on. And last but not least, to Christian Ritter, Martin Schmidt, Andrea Gantz, Hauser, and especially to Carla Schupp for support throughout the preparation of this conference. So I'd like to make initial framing of how I see the problems related to automated justice and give a kind of a presentation, introductory presentation. So new language and new knowledge production has entered crime and security domain also. So the new mathematical language serves security purposes well. Amour, for instance, one of the authors, says the mathematical sciences offer a grammar of combinatorial possibilities that allows things, people, objects, data to be arranged together for links to be made. So I'd like to talk first about semantics and new language and new knowledge production in criminal, how to understand what is crime and how to react to crime. So new concepts and tools are being invented in reacting to crime in order to understand crime, so knowledge production, and act upon this crime. For instance, we are witnessing terms such as meaning extraction, sentiment analysis, opinion mining, computational treatment of subjectivity in text, etc. So the pressure to institute a process of datafication, turning everything into numbers, people, persons, criminal cases, in order to monetize data and create actionable data. This is kind of what the police chiefs are looking at, how to make data, police data, more actionable. Is at the core of this big data logic, entering also in the crime and security control domain. All this is my claim, and this is why this conference has to be, I mean, we are preparing this conference, is that these are rearranging and blurring the boundaries in the security and crime control. So boundaries, what does it mean for the police to have a suspect? What is a convicted person, etc. So the start and finish of the criminal justice process is now indefinite and indistinct, writes Marx, Bowling, and Kinnan. Agencies mandated to fight terrorism, for instance, are now in pursuit of spotting persons of interest, not suspects, persons of interest, meaning not only what the person might be, but what the person might become. Similarly, the Eindhoven Living Lab, this is the Living Lab in the Netherlands, checks for escalated behavior, not suspicious behavior, but escalated behavior to arrive at big data generated determinations of when to intervene. The notion includes yelling, verbal and otherwise aggressive behavior, or showing signs that person has lost self-control. Don't ask me what's that. Such behavior is targeted and mediated then in order to be diffused. So the goals of the interventions are to induce subtle changes, for instance, decrease in the excitational level. That's their propaganda flyer. Similarly, intelligence agencies strive to identify sleeping terrorists. This in turn, of course, triggers an insatiable desire to throw more hay on the pile. But throwing more hay on the pile will not make the problem any easier. So advent of big data, another example, advent of big drone data lead to another intervention, the so-called signature strikes. So killings based solely on behavior patterns associated with terrorist activities. So if you compare these notions with a suspect, person of interest versus suspect, accused, convicted persons, escalating behavior to criminal behavior, sleeping terrorist, a suspect, etc., we can see that these are blurring established concept of criminal law and constitutional law. Mathematics coupled with computer science is now regarded also in tackling crime as scientific, value-free, foolproof, objective corpus of knowledge that law enforcement agencies should rely on. The far more fetched views see big data and the new analytical tools as harbinger of new paradigm shift by which science is entering into the fourth stage. According to such views, big data signals a new era of knowledge production characterized by the end of theory. So scholars are talking about the end of theory. That means the data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. The big data enterprise claims that rather than testing a theory by analyzing data, the new analytics seeks to gain insight born from the data. So we don't need to have a hypothesis, but only the data will speak for itself. So what are the consequences of such new semantic and new knowledge? Well, the language of big data is steering down the world of what counts as crime-relevant knowledge. So crime-relevant knowledge is database. What counts as proper reasoning? Algorithms are proper reasoning. And how should we tackle crime? Predictive policing. How should we prosecute cases and adjudicate cases? Automated justice. So how to understand or contextualize these shifts in what counts as the proper knowledge in the crime control domain? Well, if we look back, we can see that in criminology, Garland was making an excellent article about it, we can see that statistics was always at the cornerstone of criminology. So in the 19th century already, the emerging modern state, with its strong regulatory ambitions, found in statistics especially the knowledge to legitimize the process of disciplining dangerous classes. So statistics was the knowledge that was justifying the powerful their interventions. Criminology served to legitimize and extend this modern penal power by presenting punishment as a scientific procedure. So it was kind of critical, this new criminology was critical of the ancien regime, superstition, medieval torture, witch hunt, of course, that happened there, these formal evidentiary rules in criminal procedure. So in criminology, we can see that there are competing scientific knowledges how to understand crime. So for instance, in the 60s and 70s, psychoanalysis was regarded as the knowledge of how to understand crime. For instance, this is reflected in the popular culture. For instance, if you see the film Psycho of the Alfred Hitchcock, Bates, when police officer explains Bates's crime, he says, if anybody gets any answers, it will be the fellow talking to him now, the psychiatrist. So the psychiatrist with the knowledge of psychoanalysis was regarded as the man with the knowledge to explain crime. Later on, with neo-positivism in criminology, we have these genetics, we have discussions about violent genes that are important, dysfunctional brains, so looking at neuroscience. And now we have this new knowledge, mathematics, so new language that serves security purposes as well. So what is problematic with that? Well, problem is that in policing, mathematical models are now dominating law enforcement, so law enforcement agencies. So this is regarded as the knowledge. Every part of the policing should look at. And in justice, so relying, Bernard Harcourt, for instance, made good research about it. So how relying on risk assessment is really also convenient for judges. It's not that they regard it as something they would discard, but it's kind of dispersing their own responsibility for cases to be adjudicated. So it's good to have a risk assessment. The score the computer says this guy or woman should be sent to jail for X time. So, but my question here is, aren't both biased? So we have biased judges all over through centuries. Judges, human adjudicators are biased. On the other hand, we have machine reasoning that is also biased. I think there's more about discussion, not which is biased or not, but which bias do we want? So it's not possible to debias computers. And my question is also, is the bias also desired? But what do I mean by that? By whom should be done? Should computer scientists debias, for instance, decision-making process? Rules, criminal procedure rules, for instance, or constitution was adopted in a democratic process that distilled the prevailing interest conceptions of human nature in a given society. And now we expect that this process should be overridden by computer scientists in a laboratory. So is the bias desired? I don't know. What about human empathy and other personal qualities? So we want judges to have human empathy. So these are biased kind of conceptions. So there could be discussion whether we want this bias or not. So, and I'll talk about debiasing if it's even possible. So how to contextualize this kind of knowledge shifts in language? We could have a long discussion about automated governance after Cambridge Analytica and all these discussions about how they influenced elections, referenda, etc., etc. So a little bit of situating of criminal justice in this larger context. I would say that the new knowledge power nexus is changing the governance of society. We can see this in insurance domain, we can see this in banking domain, in labor, in education, etc., etc. I think it has profound implications for the political system. I think, just to give you one example, Facebook experiment from 2014, let us think of this experiment. For instance, what they were claiming, and this is the article when the results were presented, they manipulated news feed in Facebook users, for the Facebook users, 700 Facebook users. And what did they achieve is the idea was then that they achieved emotional contagion. So their mood was changed because of the manipulation of a news feed. So this demonstrates then that kind of experience, how today there exist powerful tools for inducing or also disrupting the spread of ideas, not just mood, whether something is more depressive or not, or more positive. Such tools used for emotional contagion, I would say, may be used to produce political contagion also amongst the public at large. And of course, this is a quote from this experiment, not that important. So I think we have implications not just for emotional and also political contagions, if I may say. And of course, I'm not inventing something new here. We all know about this, the incident or the use of data. Cambridge Analytica used Facebook users' data, and how this was kind of rocketed in the stratosphere, how they used, and we don't know exactly how many data. They claim that they gathered 5,000 data points on each voter in the United States. We don't know whether that's true or not. They use psychological profiling then to conduct micro-targeting. So what's the difference is that these political parties, etc., they're not targeting populations at large, but micro-targeting, like in Amazon, you have a micro-targeting of users. So authors are writing, this is a weaponized artificial intelligence propaganda machine, right? Used to manipulate our opinions and behavior to advance specific political agendas. An invisible machine that preys on the personalities of individual voters to create large shifts in public opinion. This is from the Anderson and Horvath. There were also other experiments, such as I voted experiment in Facebook in 2014, I think. So in political domain, if we see the digital technologies, we have these less dangerous ones, or less, that are not that didn't change political domain that much. For instance, e-government, right? E-voting systems, getting votes, getting support for initiative through referendum, via internet, etc. So these are not that kind of powerful votes. But then we have micro-targeting, we have search engine manipulation, we have social media manipulation, and meddling with elections, called as digital gerrymandering from the train already in 2014. We have this kind of processes in many countries. There's not United States only, but we have total information awareness system in Singapore, for instance, gathering data from all parts. Forever possible for smart city, right? So gathering data from plane companies, etc. So we have credit rating system in China. We have also an interesting case in member of the Council of Europe. So Russia is member of the Council of Member States of the Council of Europe, and we had a nice case for lawyers, Roman Zakharov versus Russia, right? Where we could see that law enforcement agencies, security agencies were gathering massive data from from public telecommunications networks. So if we were asking why there's no opposition in Russia, maybe this is a question, right? If you're gathering so much data from population, you could pinpoint to persons of interest, and you could disrupt the spread of their ideas, etc., etc. So these are kind of maybe utopian, but we can see now and then in a public scandal like Cambridge Analytica that this is already going on. So the question is whether we have the rule of law or the rule of algorithms, to be provocative a bit, whether we have democracy or algocracy. So this is a term coined, I think, that, I don't know, by Morozov, or not. So these are kind of bigger questions. So to focus more on justice and policing, to zoom in, artificial intelligence, algorithms, big data has been entering also this domain, as I said, and through all these agencies. We could look at intelligence agencies, what are they doing, how they are collecting data. We could look at law enforcement agencies, criminal courts, through remand and parole procedures, then probation commissions in the phase of executing criminal sanctions, how much in each country they're using it, that kind of tools. And of course, the offices of legal counselors. So artificial intelligence has been used to predict the outcomes of legal problems, to decide on co-financing litigations, to help human lawyers conduct research more quickly. And of course, they have been tested to predict judicial decisions of the higher courts. For instance, one example for the US, they were trying to predict the judicial decisions of the Supreme Court, similar to in Europe. The research claimed that our model can predict the court's decisions with a strong accuracy, 79% on average. So these are kind of examples now how big data and algorithms are already being used. For instance, cases of automated policing include preventive screening of Muslims in Germany. So those suspected to be terrorist sleepers due to the general threat situation. This was in the aftermath of the police and intelligence agency decision to try to identify unrecognized Muslim fundamentalists after 9/11 in the so-called dragnet investigations. So these dragnet investigations means this is a preventive profiling instrument when some characteristic information of future assassins and or other criminal offenders have been discovered. So you're looking at the past offenders and then trying to pinpoint to focus the attention of the intelligence agencies to those sleeping terrorists. For instance, in Slovenia, a small country, when I come from, Slovenian police created a Twitter analysis tool during Occupy movement several years ago to track persons of interest and for sentiment analysis purposes. And we don't know exactly, you know, they were kind of first denying using such tool and then admitting that they have a tool, but it's not just, it's not to point to persons, but only to check the sentiment analysis in the country. So we don't know exactly what's going on, to be frank. And other countries, which had Predpol, very famous one, notoriously known in Santa Cruz, Comstead, New York, Precops in Zurich and Munich, for instance, Map Révélation, I think, in France. So different systems already being used in all over, I would say, the world. Predpol, just example of how these squares are made in a city. Atlanta, the next one, Blue Crash system, criminal reduction utilizing statistical history. Another example of police uses of big data and algorithms. For instance, granularity is one of the features of the system. Granular tracking of crime patterns enables police to predict future crime hotspots and direct police resources there proactively. Beware program, for instance, the Washington Post was writing about the threat scores, calculating your threat score. So what is it? The program scored billions of data points, including arrest reports, property records, commercial databases, deep web searches, and the man's social media postings. It calculated his threat level as the highest of 3 color-coded scores. So you were given a color based on all these data. One good example, for instance, for students is automated inference of criminality using a face imaging. That was kind of notorious, I would say, research conducted by 2 researchers that were trying to infer, kind of using Lombrosian techniques, infer criminality from how people look. So based on still face images of 1,900 real persons, they were saying, we can, half of them convicted, we can find out the patterns of criminal face. So they used kind of high technology, computer vision, pattern recognition with supervised machine learning. So this research is actually very kind of excellent to show what could go wrong with the use of algorithms and big data in crime control domain. So the first line, you can see the 4 subtypes of criminal faces in the first on the top, and below 3 subtypes of non-criminal faces. As you can see in the below line, people are smiling. So they say lip curvature, eye inner corner distance, nose-mouth angle. These are the important features of your face indicating that you may become a criminal. But assumptions that are here are very kind of, we always laugh, but when a child asks why this is problematic, I see this man and I know he's a criminal. So it's kind of an assumption that we have, that kind of a common sense people would say, yeah, there is some truth in that. But what are these assumptions? So the assumption is that the appearance of a person's face is a function of innate properties. So this is assumption that people have some kind of immutable core that doesn't change over time. And this is reflected through our face. So, and also, so that criminality is a kind of property of certain people. And then also, this is the implicit assumption is that criminal justice can reliably determine such criminality. When someone I worked 2 years in the criminal court, so when you know this operation of how the court works, you can know that these processes are not that precise. Even if the inner core would be reflected in someone's face, the court wouldn't be able to recognize it very correctly. So these are these assumptions of, I would say, algorithmic phrenology, so Lombroso coming in new form, legitimizing and normalizing existing implicit biases. It's laundering of human prejudice through computer algorithms, right, Arcas et al. A lack of understanding what the task actually is measuring and what patterns the systems is actually finding. So, on the other hand, when Sherry Turtle were asking in the United States people whether they would be liked more to be judged by computer or by human being, Black Americans were saying that they would like to be judged by a computer program. So my point is, if you have a really bad system that is already very biased, and you could find these such systems in every country. For instance, in Slovenia, we have probation system. It's absolutely, totally biased. It's a black box conducted by human beings, of course. But if you have a very bad procedures, of course, computers can ameliorate the deficiencies and make it better. So we had specific procedures in criminal justice. We cannot just say criminal justice at large. We have pre-trial detention procedures, remand procedures. We have evidence gathering and evaluation where these tools can be used. We have sentencing procedure and parole. So these are, at least these 4 procedures are very different procedures where machine learning can be used with caution. So a little bit of risk and troubles, and then I'll finish up. What are the risks with using such tools in criminal justice domain? Well, building algorithms for sure, and that's kind of roughly building algorithms and functioning of algorithms. When building algorithms, this is a human craft, of course. People build algorithms. This question then relates to data, which data is taken and used, which data is left out of the calculus. So this is this is a decision that has to be made by human beings. How data is cleaned and prepared. Furthermore, different sorts of data are not of the same quality. Social media posts are not as trustworthy as official records, such as property records. So this process of preparing data is inherently political in the sense that the methodological decisions are made by humans. Data needs to be generated, protected, interpreted. The other general part is how the algorithms function, right? So the second question relates to the question, how can they take unpredictable path to reach their objectives, as they're not neutral, but rather reflect choices about data, connections, inferences, interpretations, and thresholds for inclusion that advance a specific purpose. And of course, we can exclude these typical attributes that has to be excluded in the democratic society, such as ethnicity, race, gender, etc. But still, algorithms can take different paths. We have discussions about proxies. So for instance, O'Neill was talking geography as a proxy for race. Bernard Harcourt was explaining how we can exclude race from algorithms, sentencing algorithms, but still race can get in as it's a proxy for crime. So we have these proxies that algorithms can calculate, and we cannot avoid. So there's a blurring, another big question, blurring of probability, causality, and certainty. Correlation and certainty that are not the same thing. So, for instance, risk assessments yield probabilities, not certainties. They measure correlations and not causations, and do not reflect objective truth. So while they may be very good at finding correlations, these systems, they cannot judge whether or not the correlations are real or ridiculous. Correlations do have to be examined by human. They have to be ascribed a certain meaning. I would say there's also a problem of domain transfer, people working with machine learning in one domain, for instance, in earthquake, like I think that Compass experts were working in the earthquake, analyzing earthquakes, and then they're going in another domain. I would say that criminal justice domain already embeds some values, some political decisions, for instance, fairness over efficiency. This is a huge dilemma, whether we want to optimize fairness or efficiency. If we want to optimize efficiency, police, we don't need a criminal procedure code, right? Police doesn't need criminal procedure code if we want to optimize efficiently. So going into everybody's houses, etc., etc. So also, for instance, for what reasons these calculations are made? For example, in tracking domestic violence, is this done with the objective to help children that are at risk in such families, or this is done with the objective to focus the gaze of surveillance on the potential offender? So these are different. And of course, the example of criminal faces, completely ignoring the real operation of the legal system, the nature of law as discourse, this is important, the nature of language, confusing normative and empirical level. So that are two different levels. So debiasing, I was talking about whether debiasing is even desired, but is debiasing even possible? In an article from Science, Kaliskan, Bryson, and Narayan were explaining how debiasing language at the language level, debiasing is even not possible. The training of machines on language corpora means that artificial intelligence will inevitably imbibe these biases as well. The researchers claim that the process of debiasing cannot help eliminate the biases either. The result may only be fairness through blindness, they claim, because prejudice can creep back in through proxies. So debiasing language is not possible because language has these gender biases and many other biases. Inequality, so we have this over-policing, huge discussion of over-policing, how some communities are being over-policed, but I would also claim under-policing. Who is being under-policed? Which geographic areas, but not only which geographic areas. Maybe even more important, what types of crimes are not being looked at? What about economic crime? What about financial crime? What about what's happening in the banks? So these are the crimes that cause the biggest harm in society. They can destroy whole economies. So these crimes are not being looked at with crime mapping for robberies, etc. So what's being underpoliced and how crime is being understood? For instance, squares in Bahnhofstrasse or the London city. How many crimes would we see there if we would have these squares? We have other problems than judicial evolution. If we base the system on past legal cases, we have this infinitum problem. With the external past, this is external past, so we are just, we can see that all the big cases, for instance, US court, Miranda versus Arizona, Brewer versus Williams, these big cases that gives us Miranda rights and also that gave us rights, right? These basic rights in criminal procedure. These were outlier cases. These weren't the cases based on past decisions, right? So we have this kind of legal evolution that can stop. We have this vicious circle effect that, like example of over-policing, and the place of subjectivity changes in that kind of systems. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, we don't have this case-specific narrative anymore. So Franco Ass, for instance, was very critical about it. Already in 2005, she was claiming we have change in focus on the criminal courts from narrative to supposedly more objective and biased computer databases. So she detected change from narrative to database. And I would say, go even further today, that we have a change from database to automated justice, because database still has to be some kind of interpreted by the human being, and human being is very kind of a suspect, right? We cannot rely on a human being. So to conclude, automation in crime control domain is then blurring the established constitutional and criminal law concepts. Criminal procedures, these concepts are important. Why? Because these are curbing the power of the central monopoly of physical force, and these concepts attempt to confine state agencies and prevent abuses of power. So the concepts such as a suspect, accused, convicted person has some meaning in criminal procedures. Standards of proof, what is reasonable doubt, what is ground for suspecting that something happened, what is beyond reasonable doubt. These are all standards that are there to curb the power of the police, state monopoly, etc., etc. What is the right to a lawful judge? What is a fair and public hearing? These are all rights that emerged through constant battle for rights in criminal procedure. So these concepts then serve as regulators and thresholds for the intervention of law enforcement agencies. The new concepts and mathematical language no longer sufficiently confine agencies nor prevent abuses of power. These move towards a system of automated justice. Marx says, minimize human agency and undercuts due process safeguards built in the traditional criminal justice model. And the last slide, the balance between competing values in criminal control is now being renegotiated. From this is transition from ex post facto punishment system to ex ante preventive measures. The existing legal doctrines and in constitutional criminal law already embody, that's what sort of to wrap up, already embody decisions about the strength of competing values, such as efficiency or fairness. For instance, in a democratic liberal response to crime, it's regarded it is better to leave 10 criminals walk free and avoid sentence than convict one innocent person. This is a decision that has already been made. This is the litmus test of authoritarian and democratic political systems. And these balancing acts are now being renegotiated. Thank you very much for your attention. As I was a bit longer than expected, as usually, I'd like now to open the first session. I hope you will enjoy this session, and I strongly encourage you to ask questions afterwards. It's my great honor today to welcome 3 speakers in this first session. The first speaker is Jeff Larson. In 2016, ProPublica published an article by Julia Anguin, Jeff Larson, Surya Matu, and Laureen Kirchner called Machine Bias. In this article, they revealed the prevalence of predictive models in the US justice system. These models are supposed to predict recidivism rates, the likelihood, of course, that the criminal will recommit more crimes in the future. These models are used by parole boards and in some cases by judges determining bail or even sentencing. The problem is that, as these authors discovered, that these models are rarely correct and inherently racist. We have here today with us Jeffrey Larson, one of those authors, a data scientist for this ProPublica investigation. I have to mention that their work was among the 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalists. And as the Pulitzer Prize finalists, why? Because they have investigated algorithms actually in 3 domains. How they've used these algorithms, how they being used to predict future criminals. Their work also extends to how these algorithms works, for instance, in Amazon, so in the other domain, and the third domain also in online shopping and social media. So criminal justice, online shopping, and social media. So we're very much grateful, Jeff, to be with us today and fly all over to California. The floor is yours.